So, what if the US government wasn't just watching Tupac Shakur? What if it was actively at war with him? Now, I know that's a huge, almost unbelievable claim, and it's the central argument of the book we're going to break down today. To really get what this book is talking about, you have to start with Tupac's own words. According to the author we're looking at, this wasn't just some edgy lyric in a song. This was a declaration of war, and it was one the US government supposedly heard loud and clear. Okay, it is absolutely crucial to say this right up front. Everything we're about to dive into comes directly from this one source, the book The FBI War on Tupac Shakur by John Potash. Our job here isn't to convince you of anything, it's just to explain the really complex and frankly startling argument that the author lays out in its pages. And there it is, the core idea, right on the table. The book argues that what most of us think we know about Tupac's death, the story of a rap beef that just spiraled out of control, is basically a cover story. The real story, according to this author, is a political assassination. That's a massive claim. So let's see how the book even tries to build that case. All right, we're going to tackle this by breaking down the book's argument into 4 main parts. We'll start with how the author even builds the foundation for this claim. Then we'll zoom out to look at the historical pattern he uses for context. After that, we'll see how all of that was supposedly applied directly to Tupac. And finally, we'll get into the aftermath and the alleged cover-up. Okay, let's just dive right into section 1. When you're making a claim this extraordinary, you better have what you believe is some extraordinary evidence. So, what is this book actually built on? Well, the author, John Potash, makes it clear this isn't just a theory he cooked up. He states it's the result of over a decade of deep investigation. The book says its conclusions are based on over 100 interviews, thousands of pages of government documents, many of which he got through Freedom of Information Act requests, and a ton of official court transcripts. This is the bedrock of evidence the author presents to the reader. Now, here's where the book's argument gets really interesting. It claims that Tupac's story doesn't actually begin with Tupac at all. To understand what allegedly happened to him, the author says we need to rewind the clock, back to a hidden war waged against Black leaders for decades. The whole idea here is that Tupac wasn't some isolated case. He was, according to the book, the end result of a long-standing secret government policy. It basically reframes his story as the last chapter in a saga of state repression that included neutralizing figures like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And according to the author, neutralize was a government code word for, well, anything from discrediting them in public to assassination. So the key to all of this, the actual mechanism for this supposed war, was a program called COINTELPRO. Now, this was a real FBI program, and according to the book, understanding COINTELPRO is the key that unlocks the entire argument. It claims its sole purpose was to disrupt, discredit, and, ultimately neutralize any Black activist group the government saw as a threat. And how did they do it? Well, the book lays out a very specific playbook. We're talking about stuff like forging letters to make allies turn on each other, planting fake stories in the news, arresting leaders over and over on small charges just to drain their money and time, and maybe the scariest one, using undercover agents to create rivalries and then push them towards actual violence. Keep these tactics in your head, because the book claims every single one of them was used against Tupac. And this timeline just lays it out so clearly, the direct line the book tries to draw. You see the peak of COINTELPRO operations against people like MLK and the Black Panthers, and then bam, right in the middle of it all, Tupac is born. And he's not just born into America, he's born into the very heart of the movement, to a prominent Black Panther leader. The book presents his life and death not as a separate thing, but as a direct continuation of this story. So with all that historical background laid out, the book then zooms way in, and it starts applying that COINTELPRO playbook piece by piece to the life and career of Tupac Shakur. So why Tupac? Why him? According to the author, it was basically his birthright. He was Black Panther royalty. His mother, Afeni, his stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, his godfather, Geronimo Pratt, they were all major leaders. The book argues that from the second he was born, he was on the government's radar, and when his own powerful political voice started to emerge, he became a top target. And to back this up, the book throws out a pretty staggering number: over 4,000. That's how many pages the author claims the FBI had in its file on Tupac. But get this, when a Freedom of Information Act request was filed, only 99 pages were released, and they were all blacked out and heavily redacted. So the book asks a pretty simple question. What in the world is in the other 3,900 pages? And this quote from Tupac himself is used to highlight one of those key COINTELPRO tactics we talked about, harassment arrests. The book's point is that Tupac's legal troubles, this constant stream of arrests and lawsuits, they didn't really start until his music gave him a national voice. It presents this not as just bad luck, but as a deliberate strategy to tie him up in the legal system and destroy his public image. Okay, this right here is one of the biggest and most explosive claims in the book. It alleges that the infamous East Coast-West Coast rap war wasn't a real beef. It was manufactured. So how? The author points to classic COINTELPRO tactics, specifically using fake letters and prison informants, a tactic the book calls penal coercion, to feed Tupac bad information while he was locked up. They supposedly convinced him that his own friends, like Biggie Smalls, had set him up in that 1994 shooting, and the goal, the book claims, was to create a feud so intense it would eventually lead to violence. So this brings us to the final part of the book's argument. What happened after those fatal shots were fired in Las Vegas, and why the author believes this whole story is more relevant today than ever before. The book is completely unflinching here. It doesn't paint the official investigation as just incompetent or bungled. No, it describes it as a deliberate, methodical effort to hide the truth of what really happened that night. And here's what the book presents as its Exhibit A for that cover-up claim. It's all about Yaffe Fula, a member of Tupac's group The Outlaws, who was riding in the car right behind him. The book alleges that Fula went to the police and said, "I saw the shooter. I can identify him." But publicly, the police kept saying they had no witnesses. For 2 whole months, the author says, Fula was completely ignored by investigators. And then, right before he could give an official statement, he was murdered. And according to the book, Yaffe Fula wasn't a one-off thing. The author brings up another jaw-dropping number. 28. That's how many people with close ties to Tupac or his murder case have died under mysterious or violent circumstances since 1996. 28. And maybe the most famous of those 28, according to the source, is the lead detective on the case himself, Russell Poole. The book explains how Poole became convinced there was a massive cover-up happening inside the LAPD. He ended up resigning in protest. And then, years later, he was literally in a meeting with the LA County Sheriff's Department, presenting new evidence to try and reopen the case, when he had a fatal heart attack, right there in the middle of the meeting. So why does any of this matter now? Well, the book ends by arguing that this isn't just old history. It draws a straight line from the COINTELPRO of the 60s and 70s to the modern FBI's classification of Black Lives Matter activists as Black identity extremists. It suggests the exact same playbook is still being used today, just against a new generation. And that leaves us with the book's final haunting question. It basically asks us to throw out everything we thought we knew about this legendary story. It challenges us to ask, what if the murder of one of the most important cultural figures of his time had absolutely nothing to do with music, and everything to do with silencing a political voice that some people feared was becoming way too powerful?